Welcome to Strength Chat Podcast, presented by Kabuki Strength. Introducing your hosts, Chris Duffin, the mad scientist of strength, Rudy Cantwell, mature athlete and coach, and the wizard of training himself, Brandon Senn.
Welcome to Strength Chat with your host, the mad scientist of strength, Chris Duffin, myself. To my right, we've got...
Do you want to start over?
Dr. Rudolph, our mature athlete and coach. And to my left, the wizard of training, the man with no calves, Brandon Senn.
Man with average calves. Average.
Someday. Today we're really excited to have Dr. Bryan Mann on the show. And he just recently released a book, Developing Explosive Athletes, Use of Velocity-Based Training in Training of Athletes. So we've got that here in the front for our viewers of the podcast. But we've been following Bryan's work for a number of years here at Kabuki Strength. Our listeners know that we're heavily involved in using VBT. And there's not a lot of people out there publishing content on it. And Bryan Mann has been doing that. So, Bryan, I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about, just start off, like how did you get down this path of implementing VBT with your athletes at the school, and just where you're at today with its use?
Yeah, well, it actually all starts with a road trip to Columbus and Cleveland, Ohio. Well, and we could even start before that. Back in 1999, I started as a volunteer assistant as an undergraduate at a small school called, well, small, not really. It's like 21,000 students. But it was a directional school, Southwest Missouri State. So athletic department-wise, it was 1AA. It was a smaller school that way. And the head strength coach was named Rick Perry. And Rick had this just huge library that it was huge at the time. Now I think I might have him trumped, but he had a bunch of these Soviet texts, the translated Soviet texts, the very, very rough Bud Charniga Sport Ivany Press translated texts, and I started reading all of those, and I happened to see that there's these things called, these numbers that were in there that were listed out in meters per second, and I just kind of stuck it away in the back of my mind, and we happened to go to Westside Barbell in Columbus, Ohio, and then we were going up the road to the Cleveland Browns when Buddy Morris, Tom Zielinski, and Rob Phillips were on staff up there to visit with them, since it was just a few-hour drive. And if we're going to go, 10 hours, we might as well make an extra 2 to get a couple extra visits in. And we did that while we were on spring break. So that's what our spring breaks always were, is they were visiting other weight rooms to get more ideas. And Louis Simmons, just that month, whenever we went, I think it would have been 2000 or 2001. It had to be 2001 because I could drink beer at the bar. Yeah, that's kind of funny. Now my thoughts are so clouded I can't even remember whenever I could start drinking and relate things to that. But I knew
you've been drinking too much beer.
I could legally drink at that point, and have a drink with everybody else. It was great. But Lou just published that article on the Tendo unit. Mm-hmm. And we happened to see it up there and see it in use. And I'm like, dude, that reads out in meters per second? That's got to be what MS means. And then whenever Rick and I were driving up to Cleveland, I told him, I'm like, look, man, your book, Roman, The Training and Management of the Weightlifter, The Fundamentals of Special Strength Training, and one other book, it's got this stuff in here. I think I know what to do with this. And then we went and visited Buddy and Tom and Rob, and on the way back, it's where it all started. And some of the things are different than what we had for the Olympic weightlifters, what we did for the athletes, and it's more of a necessity of dealing with masses. But then whenever I got here to Missouri back in 2004, had a head football coach at the time that was a absolute numbers junkie. And if you didn't get certain percentages of PRs on your different lifts, your different exercises, you're going to get fired, because that's what he wanted. And I'm saying that to get to this next point. So I ended up starting a PhD program in 2006, and you've got to take statistics for that. And statistics, I just lost you. You guys still there?
Yeah, we're still there. Can you hear us?
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I just did that spinny thing. So
Yeah,
I
we'll
wanted to
just
make sure I didn't,
we'll just do it without the video, I guess. So just keep rolling.
Yeah, it's good now. I think my phone for some reason decided to connect to the computer. I don't know. But we had gotten into having all these huge numbers. We had multiple guys cleaning well over 400 pounds. Probably 20, 25 guys cleaning over 400 pounds. And in the stats class that I had to do, we were supposed to do things that we cared about. We had to do a 25-page mini thesis. So what did I write it on? I thought I was going to kind of cheat the system, and you do.
We're going to call him back.
Okay.
And ask him to restart. It's okay.
Yeah, the sound quality was really bad.
His internet, something happened to his
Yeah, either that or he has a squirrel in his office there.
There we go.
Sorry, the audio quality was getting really bad for some reason. So.
Gotcha. Where should I start over at?
You started working on your PhD thesis.
You had 20 some guys that were cleaning over 400 pounds.
Yeah, we had a bunch of guys that were cleaning over 400, and I decided that with this class, I was going to do this paper on to this 25-page mini thesis on how cleans were related to vertical jump. So if your clean goes up, your vertical jump should be going up. And I wrote this paper out. I was supposed to be traveling with the women's basketball team when the paper was due. So I thought I want to cheat the system here and write this thing that I absolutely know this is how it's supposed to be. And then that way I can just have my feet up and relax whenever it's due. All I got to do is run in and fill in the stats when we learn how to do a backward stepwise logistic regression.
I can see where this is going.
Yeah. I don't remember how to do it. I basically remember how it's called. I don't even think I've had SPSS in like the last 5 years since I've had this computer, which I don't think this computer is going to make 6 the way that it's going today. But so whenever I ran that statistic, basically, long story short, is that I found there was no relationship. And I went to my professor because I didn't believe it. It was like, Dr. Osterlin, there's got to be something wrong here. The guy statistically is brilliant. His degrees in statistics were from Stanford, Princeton, and Yale. I mean, there's nobody smarter than this guy. And he sits down and he looks at everything and he looks at the coding. We sit there and talk about the data for a minute to make sure I use the appropriate statistic. He's like, yeah, no, this is the booger about statistics. Sometimes you find out what you think is true is completely false. So we had to, as a staff, sit back and see, if we're doing these Olympic lifts to improve explosive strength and it's not working, why is that? And whenever you get down to it, it's because we were turning an explosive lift into a strength exercise. Our cleans were more like Dimmel deadlifts with rack pull and a limbo and a lateral lunge and a reverse curl in there somehow. And the weights were huge, but there was no carryover. So then when we started using velocity as a parameter, it started working, and there became a relationship again. And it was the third relationship. Improvement in body composition was number 1. Improvement in squat strength was number 2. And then improvement in clean load over a minimum threshold velocity was number 3. And then we took that, we took that basically and applied it towards the other exercises, and we did so in a team setting. So by team setting, I mean, if we've got overall in the entire department, we've got something like 520 some odd athletes and 10 coaches. And if we need to keep all of those people on the same page, we've got to do things very simply. So we broke things down by height and by trait as it relates on average between percentage of 1RM and the exercises. So, we kind of take the stuff that's already been out there with the strength continuums, mix that in with some velocity, and then you implement it in with the team system and the team setting, and the results were fantastic. Basically, I put this in the book, but on average, and before when we started doing velocity stuff, so from 2000 to about 2006, our data was exactly the same that was published from Oklahoma State and Texas A&M. where we would have huge improvements in strength and huge improvements in speed and power for the first year. For the second, third, and fourth year, we saw huge improvements in strength, but no improvements in speed. And by speed, I mean running speed, 40-yard dash type things, or explosive power as measured by a vertical jump. When we started using velocity, we were getting improvements for 3 years instead of 1. So we had an additional 2 years of development just from simply using velocity with the velocity zones. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. But it was good enough.
Understanding context and application is so critical. Like, when I started using velocity myself, which was maybe 5 years ago, and, reading like how most powerlifters were using it at the time, which was, velocity measurements were only used for dynamic effort days. And you're working like 0.7, 0.8 meter per second range. And, just working on trying to be faster with those weights. And I did that for a while and found that there was actually very little carryover for making improvements for that, for like my max effort lifts, which were in the like 0.11, 0.12 range. And so we started shifting to managing, using it for more applicable ranges for what our training was, and then using velocity within that. And then we started seeing, big changes. And then we shifted, the last several years into using it as an auto-regulation parameter. We've probably been doing auto-regulation with it for, 3-4 years?
Yeah.
About that. So, but I just found it, because at first it was, that's everybody in the strength training community, again, different, but you got to understand the context and application, right? I mean, taking a 600-pound, squatter that's a lineman and taking him to a 620-pound squat doesn't mean that you're going to do anything to improve his game, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, if they're really weak, getting them stronger makes everything better.
Exactly.
But if they got their requisite strength, then, it's kind of like pouring water in a full bucket. It's just going to spill over the sides. It doesn't do nothing.
Exactly. And, there's strength coaches out there that don't want to hear that. Oh, if I take him from a 600 to 620, I did my job. But, your job is actually to make them better on the field. So.
Right. Yeah. So it's one of those, point of diminishing returns. Let's improve the sport. Let's talk about transfer rather than just the how to get them stronger. Yeah, getting them stronger is low-hanging fruit. It's easy to see if you got them stronger. It's a lot harder to tell, did I make this a better athlete or not? And that's I think that might be part of the reason for the popularity of the strength. And to be honest with you, for the first probably 10 years of my 19 years in strength and conditioning, that's all it was if they got stronger, they were better athletes. And in the last 7 years, I've really changed my thought process on it.
So, Bryan, we talked about velocity zones. Let's dig into that a little bit more. So, velocity zones, the way that you've created them, are defined by trait-specific or quality-specific. How does that change, or how do those zones shift across different movements? For example, is a back squat strength speed zone the same as what a bench press would be? Is it very much velocity specific, or do you find it's actually movement specific as well?
So it does very much depend on the exercise that you're using. So whenever we went with the back squat, the bench press, and the deadlift, and they're not perfect, but it's good enough. Whenever you're looking at a difference of about 0.08 meters per second between the 1 RM, between a bench press and a squat, and basically to be able to keep all the coaches on the same page and all the athletes on the same page and not have people messing up, we went with just the one set zone. If somebody wanted to dial in, it would be actually very exercise specific. For instance, the front squat. The front squat has got a much flatter slope than the back squat. Why is that? Because if you try and move maximal velocity on lighter loads with the front squat, you may or may not have the barbell come up, fly, hit you in the chin, and necessitate you having a beard because you didn't have medical insurance, and that's just one nasty-ass scar.
No kidding.
Not that may or may not have actually happened.
It's a good-looking goatee you got there, Bryan.
That's right, brother. Yeah, gotta have it. But, so the zones don't necessarily go for all the different exercises. And then if you look in the book for all the Olympic lifts, I've prescribed individual velocities for those because they were so different. There wasn't just like a good enough. Now, I guess I've got to jump back over. We didn't use the front squat, and we didn't use the front squat for velocity. We just used the back squat, the bench press, and the deadlift, because with those 3 exercises, and trap bar deadlift ended up being about the same as a regular deadlift, conventional or sumo. Those were our bread and butter exercises, so that's what we stuck with. But, the more that I've gotten into it and the more criticisms that has been drawn to it, and a lot of people are right, that it doesn't work for everything. So some people use overhead squat as one of their bread and butter exercises. Of course it doesn't work for that. There's so much motor control in it. Bench row is huge in rowing, in crew, exercise that I've never done or performed before. And utilizing that exercise, well, their 1RM hits at I think it's like 0.5 meters per second. So, to be in like the strength speed or whatever, it would be far higher. Whenever you get into special exercises, well, I'm kind of jumping around and jumping the gun.
No, this is perfect.
For the main bread and butter exercises, I just stick with the velocity zones to keep it simple. If I'm looking at a special exercise, and by meaning a special exercise, I mean something that, if you're looking at Bondarchuk's classification exercises, we're probably looking at an SPP or even an SDE, special physical or special developmental exercise. What I do is first, here's what I recommend, because we don't know, is I recommend that somebody does the exercise long enough and get strong in that special exercise and have perfect technique in it. After that, they simply look at the velocity as they go up and go heavier and find the velocity at which peak power occurs for that individual, because it'll be a little bit different. Some people are more, dump truck. Some people are more Ferrari. So, the dump trucks are going to be hitting it they might actually have to use a lighter weight to be able to hit a peak power. Some of the Ferrari people might have to use a heavier weight to hit peak power. But for wherever that peak power occurs, I use it off of that corresponding velocity. Some people utilize just that load. I look at the velocity instead, because of that very, very near perfect relationship between velocity and percentage of 1RM. So, some days you'd be using too heavy, some days you'd be going too light by looking at just the absolute load instead of the velocity.
Well, yeah, we definitely agree with you on that standpoint. That's, kind of a fundamental to our approach, is recognizing that relationship between your, the percentage of 1 rep max and the velocity. That's a foundational piece to understand, I think, when you're using those tools.
Absolutely. The zones are or simply, like I said, it's working with 60, 70 guys on the floor at one time with you and maybe one other person, and having 60 or 70 individual velocities. It just isn't going to happen because, for a couple of reasons. One of them is that we don't always have the smartest guys, and they're not going to be able to remember something. But if their training partners are all doing the same thing, they're going to be set. And the other thing is me as a coach, man, I've had like 9 concussions. I think after slipping on the ice last week, that's probably 10. But if I can't remember 60 individual velocities. So we'll go with the zones just to keep everything set. Is it perfect? No, but it's good enough. We saw results.
Yep.
So that's where,
Absolutely. In a team sport environment, makes 100%, And I'm not sure if you're familiar with how we do ours. Ours is very individualized, but that's what our client base is. We do one-on-one coaching. So we create the velocity profile for each lifter for each lift.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So that way we know exactly what their meters per second should be at. We do a linear regression line for every lift, and not necessarily every lift. We may use the squat for different squat variations. So we'll pick whatever the key lifts are. So if an overhead press is one of their key parameters, we may profile that. But typically we're profiling just squat, bench, and deadlift, but individually for each person. But again, our clientele is one-on-one based, and we've got a spreadsheet, with a database for every single client, which is not what you can do in a team sport environment at all. So
no. And that if I had just single individuals, I would probably be doing it that way. But and also back in the day, whenever you had Tendo, you didn't have GemAware or some of the others now they've got that nice user interface that allows you to look at all the other stuff you've done.
Oh, yep.
And Yeah, that makes it so much easier. And I might have changed the way that I do things.
Yeah.
But
What are you typically using for monitoring your velocity?
I've got a gym aware, and I've got a gym aware because it's the best one that I've found. And it's also a linear position transducer, so I don't have to change my velocities. Since, accelerometers and everything else, they have to use an algorithm, right, to be able to predict where the bar should be going and to change the difference for when the bar starts and stops. So that gives different velocities, and I would have to start over with the athletes. So with the gym aware, with the stuff on the cloud, it just, it changed my world on that. And it made everything so much easier rather than having to write stuff down. It's right there for me.
So I suspect you have, at Missouri, you probably have, 22 stations in your weight room?
Yeah, and we still, I guess I'm not over there in the weight room anymore. As of last January, I transitioned over into a more academic role. And basically because, there was a staff changeover. So, it's either I pick up everything and move, or I use just my academic role and I do research on the athletes. So I'm still in there, I'm still working with the athletes, but I'm not coaching. I don't have an actual team anymore. But yeah, let me try to think of how many they've got. I want to say it's actually 24 stations. So
nice.
They did have Tendo is what we used because that's what we started out with, and that's what we started assembling in 2006. And we had 16 or 18 of them. They have broken over time, and I don't know with what they're going to be going in the future. If they're going to switch over to GymAware, I know that's one of the things they've talked about. They've talked about looking at some other things too. But whatever works for them will be I'll help them out with whatever I can.
Yeah, we like the GymAwares. We've got a couple of those here, and then we use the Squats and Science, another tethered unit with the linear transducer. Haven't had much luck as of yet with the accelerometer-based units. Particularly, we could see them being applicable in team sports where maybe your zones are a little bit wider or you're using higher speed stuff. But in the strength sport world, the lower velocity, we're finding that they're just not as accurate as we'd like them to be. So again, when you're dealing with the algorithm problems, missed reps, extra reps, all that sort of stuff as well that we find, and that can be frustrating for people.
Absolutely.
So Bryan, say someone has a velocity device. What process do they go through to actually be able to use it? You talk in pretty good detail in your book about velocity zones, velocity profiling. What does the actual process look like for someone to go through those and to actually begin to implement it into their training?
So what does it look like for them to actually take whatever device and start implementing it?
Yeah.
Basically, they can start, the basic things that I would do is just simply start out with the feedback and utilizing it to see if that rep was better or worse. And whenever you get down to it, whenever you utilize if you're utilizing simply just feedback, you're going to see results. There's a study by Randall et al. And with that study, Nick Gill with the New Zealand All Blacks was on there. And so it's going to be good if you got somebody at that level on there. But basically what they found was they took two groups. They did the exact same loads, the exact same sets, repetitions, and exercises. And these are professional rugby athletes. I forgot to mention that. So pro rugby guys, they did the exact same workout, no changes in weight, no changes in training status, no differences between the groups. The group that received the feedback of velocity on every repetition on just their squat jumps saw huge improvements in speed and power. The group that didn't receive the feedback, they saw virtually no change. So that just goes in to show the effect of that feedback. If the device is accurate, if it was faster or slower. And we've got to realize and just take into account that, whenever I was growing up, video games kind of sucked. You can only play so much Frogger or Pitfall, and then you're back outside and you're playing. Well, now, with the athletes that we've got today, they grew up playing video games. They understand this concept of high score, and they're always wanting to beat the other person with the velocity or the power number or whatever happens to be. So they really start competing on that. So the first step that I would say for implementation is just throw it out there. Throw it on the bar, whatever your key exercises are that you're trying to improve power on. You're going to see results. provided that the device is accurate. If the more that you want to go down the rabbit hole, then I would look at velocity profiling. And as long as the athlete can make sure that they are going all out on every repetition throughout a 1RM test, you can just program off of velocity after that. And just instead of saying that you want the person to be doing 95% of 1RM on their back squat, 95% of them was 0.3 meters per second. So they'll go 0.3, and I would usually give them a little bit of a range. I don't like giving exact numbers. I'm a big range person because, dialing it just leads to too much frustration. If they need to be at 0.32, well, 5 pounds up, put them at 0.29. 5 pounds lower, put them at 0.36. I like zones.
We do the same thing. We give a parameter to be within for the target for the day.
Yeah, that's definitely it's something that we've slowly found over time because we have the possibility to actually profile all of our athletes. We do so, but from there we were taking our percentages as the main structural component of the training plan, and then using very specific velocity numbers to auto-regulate from that. But we found exactly that those very exact numbers of 0.31 meters per second, it was either that or it wasn't, led to a lot of frustration or maybe even some confusion or a lot of load alterations within a session. So we slowly, the majority of our athletes listening to this will be very familiar with this, but we use a zone approach predominantly in the course of our training as well. Our zones aren't quite as big as yours, and they have a little bit different terminology, but the idea is the same. And we got the idea from you, essentially, because you're the one who's been really promoting a lot of this use. But we found very similar, one, adaptation is not so specific to be to that exact meters per second. And two, we found that based on fatigue, mental energy, anything that would affect the day's ability to actually express strength, that there could be huge alterations within a set. And so we found that using even as little as a 5% difference from lightest to heaviest allowed our athletes a lot more freedom in their loads decisions and really motivated them to not only work harder, but to enjoy the training process more. The worst thing that can happen on a percentage-based program is say you have a 5x5 at 80% and you end up missing your second set. It might not be, it just wasn't there that day. Well, how do you account for that? And this is what we found to be able to do that.
So I've got a question for you, Bryan, and this is I was having dinner with a strength coach from a pro basketball team the other day, and he was working with another strength coach that was using VBT, and he was kind of frustrated, and it comes down to how you measure things and how you look at things. And so with the team, they had a specific load, but all they cared about was, with that load, increasing velocity and as a parameter. So that's what they measured it on. That's what the coach reported out on. But the person I was having dinner with was expressing frustration because he's like, well, I go in and I watch them train, and they're trying, so the athletes are trying to game the system, and they're doing a deadlift and they're ending on their toes or with a shrug, or they found ways to manipulate it to increase the velocity, but they're actually performing the lift poorly because their key parameter is only velocity. And just my background in the business world, that becomes an important thing in trying to figure out what parameters that you pick to drive the right reaction within your team to get the results for the the business or the individual that you want. And sometimes you can pick that wrong metric or use it incorrectly. Do you ever find instances like that, and how do you manage that?
Yeah, no, I have found that to happen before, and the way that I have managed it is that and the way that I explain it is that the person is called coach and not the device. And it is my job to ensure that you've got proper technique. All that device can tell you is how fast you moved it. But it didn't say if you did a deadlift or essentially a clean pull, as you're referring to.
Yep.
So if we're supposed to be deadlifting, we deadlift. If we're supposed to be clean pulling, we clean pull. If we're supposed to be back squatting, we back squat. If we're supposed to be squat jumping, we squat jump. So I just make sure that I'm there for the technique. The device is there for the speed. So I don't care what the speed is if the technique's wrong.
I'd agree with you on that. In this instance, that's exactly the case. Like, that coach had decided that he was reporting out on this and that he was going to show results to their head coach. Like, this is what I did. And he let his athletes do that, so that his numbers were better and it looked like he was doing his job. So again,
right.
That's a management issue, but you can certainly see that happening. And, if you get too lost in what you're focused on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, what is the old saying? The goal is to keep the goal.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
I found it kind of interesting. You were talking about the competition of athletes when they're looking at the speed there, and I know you have a degree in exercise physiology, and based on the statistics that the lovely regression analysis courses that you had to take and come up with this. We're talking about the physical side. Are we actually creating more power using the VBT? But I also noticed you had an emphasis in sports psychology, and it's interesting to see how folks will actually compete. This is something that without the VBT device, all we had before was how much more can you bench? How much more can I bench than you bench? But now, when we have a VBT device, the psychology of it is how much quicker can I be with the same weight? And it's not just against somebody else, but it's against your own time as well. How have you seen psychology added here to help improve the overall strength or power of an athlete? Using the VBT.
Autonomy is great. And also, we can look at it two ways. External versus internal cues. That external cue of it being faster or slower is something that the athlete can understand. And we know that by the work of, like Gabriella Wolf, Nick Winkelman, and everything, that the external cues seem to have a far greater effect on performance than internal cues. The effective velocity being an external cue, it just works out very nicely. The other thing is the effect of autonomy. And whenever the athlete is in charge of their own load selection, and whenever they are in charge of their own development and see how those adaptations occur, they tend to just simply put more into it, and it becomes an intrinsic rather than an extrinsic motivation. So we know that that horse and carrot, does it work? The stick and carrot. Does that work? Yeah, it works. It works for a short time. But this is something that allows us to look at things longitudinally and see those long-term adaptations and getting the athlete to buy in. Do all the athletes buy into it? No, they don't. And whenever they don't, we're not going to stand there over them with a stick or a whip or whatever and keep them going. We're going to have them doing something else. Is it quite as effective on the power and things like that? Oh, probably not. But they're still working hard. And we, the thing about it is that I've always got to remember to use the past, what would be called past participle, past tense, because the staffs have changed. But one of the things that we did was that we made it an honor and a privilege to utilize velocity. It wasn't a right. So they had to earn that privilege, earn the right to utilize velocity. And so that just kind of went in with that intrinsic motivation even more. So if you can set it up to something that's a privilege, that it's an honor, that they earn the right to do it, I think that made it work even that much better. Would it have been the same if we went out and did it with everyone? Well, some of the studies that we see from the soccer academies coming out of Spain, yeah, that it would still be effective. But the great thing about the way that we did it is we don't have to police anybody. If they're utilizing velocity, they're hard workers and they're going after it. And having it as that privilege and that honor and that right, and that their teammates see that just made it easy.
That's I really like that thought process. That sounds very effective.
Yeah, it was fantastic.
So Bryan, one thing, a quote that I really liked from your book, and I'm going to read it here, and it was talking about what type what alterations in velocity actually mean. So day-to-day alterations in velocity. And the quote was, one thing that should be taken into account is that VBT is measuring power, not necessarily strength. So week-to-week fluctuation of increasing or decreasing weight doesn't mean the athlete is getting stronger or weaker. Now this is pretty counterintuitive to a lot of people who might just take it out of the box. They would assume, I'm moving slower this week, something must have happened in my training. What did I do wrong? Why am I moving slower this week than last week? Can you talk to that a little bit more and really extrapolate on that point in your book?
Yeah, what I'm really trying to talk about is that it's a one-off. Whenever you've got a one-off, like you've got a really good day, that just means that you're having a really good day, that your autonomic nervous system is firing. So we've got to realize that motor recruitment is governed by the autonomic nervous system, right? That's sympathetic versus parasympathetic. How fast can I recruit motor units? And then even deeper than that, it's also governed by the central nervous system. So we've got all of those playing into account. If we're seeing days that we're fatigued, well, of course you're not, and your ANS and your CNS is depressed, you're not going to be able to recruit motor units as quickly. If you're having a great day when everything's fired up, or you've taken a stimulant, a new stimulant, or you had some other stimulus that really got you going, you might be having a great day. If we see trends, like if after 6 weeks I'm way up here and I'm always up here, then yeah, we know that the power improved. But we can actually use it as a marker of readiness. And I think at the start of the book, I put in some of the stuff from the birth of my daughter and the last workout that I did before it. The last serious. I'd go in and I'd mess around and I'd try and train just to keep training, but I hadn't done anything serious. There was like a 70-pound, 80-pound difference in my max in 8 weeks, even though I was still training. After the birth of my daughter, I went straight into the tank. Man, I think my velocity predicted max is like 331, and it was like 410 the last workout before she was born. So basically what we're looking at is you can follow it as a player readiness type model. Now, in the paper that Mladen Jovanovic, I probably butchered his name, I'm horrible with names, and Eamon Flanagan, they did an article in the Australian Strength and Conditioning Journal, and they actually followed somebody over the course of a year, and they showed that how some days they were way up high, some days they were way down low. And that's just the way that the person is. If everything is governed by the CNS and ANS, and we know how variable it is, how sensitive it is to all the different stimuli, some days are going to be good days, some days are going to be bad days. Now, we do want to pay attention to the basic trend, but we don't want to think that because I took a monster or what is that stuff with that jacked, the stuff that makes your left arm go numb and feel like I'm having a stroke.
That's my favorite, by the way.
Jack 3D.
If I took that for the first time and I've got these huge increases in my lifts, well, is that my new baseline? No, that was just a excitation of my central autonomic nervous system. The next week, whenever I come in and my dog just died and I'm not able to, lift very well, does it mean that I'm that weak? Well, no, it's just a one-off. But if I trend 3 weeks in one direction, then I know, am I getting weaker or am I getting stronger?
But that's what makes it such a powerful auto-regulation tool, though. It's
absolutely.
On your warm-ups, if you know what where you should be, well before you get to a heavy weight, like how prepared you are that day, like where are we at right now? And Brandon and I have talked about this before, but with you here, it'd be a good one to talk through. We've got my velocity profiles, right? So we do all my training that way. And the last meet we did, I had a massive weight cut. I won't say how much, but it was pretty big. And when you drop and regain that much weight, you never know. Like all my training numbers are out the window, right? It comes down to, well, where are we at today? What are we ready for? You just don't know. And so it's guesswork as you're warming up. Like, how do you feel? Because you're not going to squat what you squatted in training. All you did in training was try to get as strong as possible, and now you've just messed everything up, and you're going to find out where you're at. So we looked at my numbers on every one of my warm-ups, and we said, you know what? The numbers say you're good for an 875-pound squat today. And I went 872. And, there might have been a pound or two left. I mean, it was all I had right there.
Strong breeze would have kept you down. I think.
Exactly. And that's incredibly powerful. I mean, we knew, you're talking about projected max, but because we have my profile, my projected max was right on. I'm also, a fairly highly qualified athlete, so my movement patterns are, pretty consistent, right? So,
yep.
That wouldn't work with, somebody that's been in the game for 6 months and, their squats have a lot of variability.
Right, yeah. They haven't even learned how to squat yet. They don't, velocity isn't what they need. And that's one of the things about it, I think, that actually surprises people, is that I don't think velocity is that important. I think it is the icing on the cake, and I think it's something that people should use trying to stimulate those top-end adaptations rather than just that, entry-level thing. I remember somebody called me and they asked if they, or emailed me, whatever, and they asked if they should alter the velocity zones for a 12-year-old. And I said, you shouldn't. And they go, you shouldn't alter the zones because they're that short? I go, no, you shouldn't be using it.
Exactly.
They've got to learn the movements first. They've got to get strong first. They've got all these adaptations that need to occur before velocity. And, it's one of the key things that I've learned. Well, one of the most interesting points that I've heard is I've gotten the fortune of spending some time with Anatoly Bondarchuk. And for those who don't know him, he is the only coach in history who has swept the podium with his athletes twice in the Olympics. So if you go 1 through 3 in the Olympics 2 times, you know you're doing something right. And he says that if you give a training stimulus too soon, you've lost it twice. You lost it right then because they're not going to get that huge adaptation that they could if the base and everything else was set up. You lose it the second time because whenever you go to utilize it, whenever it would be appropriate, they've already made that adaptation, so they won't have a huge jump. So you've got to get strong first. They've got to get mobile first, and then after they are solid in their movements and not everything is going to be wiggling around, just like you just mentioned, that's whenever it becomes golden. And if I think some people start implementing it too soon, they get frustrated. Why do they get frustrated? Because they don't even know how to squat, let alone what the velocity should be.
And we have an interesting approach because we do our coaching virtually, but our step 1 is actually on movement quality. So we do a whole piece on, as a team, we review the quality of movement, we assign corrective measures, we walk through, we coach all them, but also the velocity gives us a great tool. It's like us virtually being in the room, right? Because we're not able to actually coach people one-on-one. We're doing it virtually. So between we focus on movement quality, but then we use that as, that tool so that we can help them, make the right choices in exercise selection. But you've got to have good movement first too.
Yeah.
So
this brings up a good point. Movement quality is definitely something that disturbs the actual velocity coming from the device. However, what have you found in terms of looking at specific reps as your main marker for velocity on the day? So if you have a zone that's 0.7 to 1.0, are you looking at the first rep of that set? Are you looking at the average over that set? Are you looking for a group of reps? What is your main marker to determine the actual preparedness on that day?
So I don't actually look at preparedness on the given day. What I'm going to look at is making it super simple and having all of their repetitions be within a certain range, right? Let's say we're doing dynamic effort. I'm going to have all of my 3 repetitions or 5 repetitions be between 0.85 and 0.95. If they couldn't get all 5, all whatever repetitions in that zone, we need to drop the weight down. So I'm always going to err on the side of being too fast than I am on too heavy. If I go too fast, I'm going to see power adaptations. If I go too heavy, I'm not. So I'm going to look at it that way. Now, one of the things that I've started playing with and toying with recently, near the end of my coaching career, and it's something I'm really looking at getting into because I've seen research on it now, is looking at velocity cutoffs with advanced trainees. That we want to have that high quality, and that more neural side of things. And it was an extremely interesting, and this is only good for certain sports. So when I say good for certain sports, I mean like Olympic lifting, throws, which is a great passion of mine. I've dealt with the throws coach, whatever. I just met with the throws coach about 10 days ago here, and we've got a new throws coach, and interesting relationship I think we're going to get going on there. But you can actually you can utilize velocity with small drop-offs and have huge selective hypertrophy. That we're only increasing the size of the type 2 A, 2A, 2B, whatever fibers. And the type 1 fibers don't hypertrophy at all, and as a result of that, they actually make up a smaller percentage of the cross-sectional area. It's not that we decrease the number of type 1 fibers, and not that there was a fiber conversion, or not that there was a hyperplasia, but we increased the size of those type 2 fibers. And by increasing the size of them, you increase the power and the speed capabilities of the athlete. And you look at historical cases of stuff like this, and you look at Werner Gunther, right? Werner Gunther, the great, Swiss shot putter, is a world champion. He's the guy that we all see the videos of doing all the jumps and the weird lifts and stuff like that. I believe his type 2 fiber was only something like 33, 34%. So he had the fiber type makeup of a long distance runner, but he had such great selective hypertrophy that his cross-sectional area of the type 2 fibers was huge and tremendous and far dominated the type 1. And because the neural component with the selective hypertrophy from his training, he ended up being a world champion and one of the all-time greats in the shot. So, man, how did I get onto that?
I don't know. That's really interesting, though, and I'd like to, if we don't discuss it here, maybe go back and forth on email with some of that research, because we've been looking at how to manage some of those variables as well, and haven't quite dialed that in yet. So.
Yeah, velocity loss it's something that we started out doing, but couldn't quite nail down in terms of managing actual training volumes. So that's something that's going to be really interesting to learn about in the future. From your book, you mentioned it was more appropriate to have a shorter drop-off with strength work, larger drop-off with hypertrophy work. How big of a drop-off do you see fit in terms of the strength work, or between, say, if we go to one extreme to the next, Olympic lifting to powerlifting, is there even a need for a drop-off for powerlifters, in your opinion, versus Olympic weightlifters?
Well, I can say this, that the smaller the drop-off, the more selective hypertrophy occurred. Okay, and that, the 20% paper versus the 10% paper, it was a significant difference between the two. That there was far greater selective hypertrophy of the explosive type 2 fibers in the 10% than there was the 20. For hypertrophy, it doesn't matter at all. I mean, we might as well just take the velocity off of there, because they found the greatest hypertrophy occurred with 40% and a greater velocity loss. But that just makes sense, right? Because the type 1 fibers need to hypertrophy too for maximum muscle. For a power lifter, for power lifters and Olympic lifters definitely, that selective hypertrophy is huge, because they need to be as explosive as possible. One of the things Lou often said, and it's absolutely true, it's not the strongest lifter, it's the fastest lifter that wins an Olympic weightlifting competition. And that goes in the line with, sometimes I get annoyed, and I'm easily annoyed, so that's not really saying anything. But people keep saying these correlational studies that the Olympic lifters have got the best 10 times out of anybody, and they've got some of the highest vertical jumps of anybody, so that's why you need an Olympic lift. Well, listen here, shithead. Are they good at the 10 and the 20? Are they good Olympic lifters because they're good at the 10 and the 20, or is it the other way around? Correlation does not imply causation. Let's look at the changes, and changes in what causing it. It's like, hey, you know what? The fastest guy in the 40 might be the fastest guy in the 50. Well, yeah, no shit. Right. Let's talk about something that we're looking at changes for. But the power lifter, that one's going to be a little bit interesting. And I kicked that around in my head because, the type 2 fibers are obviously the strongest and the most explosive because they have the same force generation, but they have a quicker relax time, which allows them to contract again. So it would seem as though that having selective hypertrophy of just the type 2 fibers would cause the greatest squat, bench, and deadlift. At the same time, though, if you neglect the type 1 fibers entirely, you may be missing out on an adaptation in strength, because powerlifting essentially is a non-rate limited activity, right? God, I remember seeing Mark Bell do a bench press that was like 36 seconds because the shirt was too tight and he couldn't touch. I mean, this was like 10 years ago. It was all down. I remember timing. I'm like, holy cow, I would have passed out holding my breath that long. But it's not rate limited, right? Where the Olympic lift, it is. You've got to overcome gravity and then catch the bar. The squat, the bench, the deadlift, especially with gear, not so much. As long as the bar's moving, you can still see it. Olympic lifters, it matters hugely. And, we can't really make a blanket statement either on this, because for the Werner Gunthers, if he were a power lifter, he would absolutely need to be hitting those type 1 fibers. That's what he was most of. But for somebody like, man, one of my good friends, former person that I guess I would say helped, is Christian Cantwell, right? He's one of the all-time greats in the shot put, in my opinion. First guy to throw over 70 feet in 3 consecutive meets in history. He was chasing Randy Barnes' world record, for a long time. He's since retired due to a back injury. Christian could bench 630, and it was like this. Super fast. You throw 640 on the bar, it's not going anywhere. If Christian tries to hypertrophy his type 1 fibers to get a better adaptation, he's losing the benefit of his type 2. So I think that it just goes along with individual nature and individual adaptations. If the person's more slow twitch, they need to be improving the slow twitch strength. If the person is more fast twitch, they need to be going with those velocity drop-offs, and they're going to see their best adaptation. This kind of goes in line with this conundrum, goes in line with the zones, right? And with the zones, and that conundrum is because of an old statistics joke. The statistician had his head in the oven and his feet in the freezer and said, on average, I feel pretty good. So, on average, things work. But every person, if they go with exactly what they need, they're going to see the greatest adaptation.
You might enjoy a conversation with Reese Hoffa sometime. So he's a Olympic shot putter. I think he made it to the Olympics four cycles ago. And,
Reese and Christian are buddies. If I ever someplace where Reese is going to be, I'd like to sit down and talk with him.
So Reese has implemented VBT with his training, basically at our encouragement this last Olympic cycle. But he was essentially doing that prior, so it made a lot of sense to him because he wasn't the strongest guy, and he would drop, instead of working on trying to up his bench and be a 550 bencher like his competitors were, he was around 500, and he would train with like around 400. And work on trying to be faster. Same thing, squatting. He was like 50, 75 pounds behind the guys he's competing with, but he would outthrow them. But again, he wouldn't work on trying to be stronger. He would back off and work in a different range. And so, obviously, when he started following our content and the VBT stuff made sense to him, so him and his strength coach have implemented VBT. And so anyway, you might enjoy some discussions with him, because you like your discussions around throwing. And I know that they've been using that for probably about a year now.
Great.
So a little longer,
yeah, maybe a little longer. Yeah. So anyway, just throw that out there. Same thing you're talking about. So nothing new, but another high level shot putter that's been in the game a long time has been essentially doing that with his training without the device, and now implemented it and really enjoyed the effects of that. So
yeah, I'd love to sit down and talk with him sometime.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think we're probably running up here pretty close to on time, but we're talking about velocity loss and all of those things. There's so much more research that needs to be done. In your opinion, as someone who's on the who's really on the front lines of that, what research do you think needs to further happen? Is it just more research? Do you think there's specific areas that could really use improvement in the field right now?
One of the areas that I'm starting to try and branch out into, and one of the things that I need to be done, is that we don't need to just simply look at, yes, we do need to find out what are the the on average velocity profiles for different exercises. We absolutely need to know that. So, and that's one area that the Spaniards from Sanchez Medina's lab, I believe it's University of Seville, and there's also another one wherever Fernando Pareja Blanco is. Those guys are doing some amazing work on that. Beyond that, I think we need to start looking at adaptations from the different types of training and at different points in a career. What is it that's going to cause the person to get faster and jump higher whenever they are just starting out versus whenever they get to the elite levels, the highly trained levels. We could talk about elite sport and realize that most of those guys are just genetic freaks and aren't highly trained. Those are two different things. But I think it's the adaptations. And by training at different, and what do I mean by that? Well, we know that there's something called an impulse force, right? An impulse force is just a high force over a brief point in time. And we can look at things like an isometric mid-thigh pull or simply a counter movement jump. And we can look at the impulses that are on it, or we can look at the time bands from the isometric mid-thigh pull. And looking at how we know the relationship that exists between some of those time bands and some of those impulse forces and adaptations in sport. Well, how does training with different exercises influence that? And that's something that I think that we need to look at rather than just how to get the biggest squat, bench, and deadlift, which I do greatly care about, but how do we get the greatest transfer to sport? And I think that's where we need to go.
Yeah, that's one thing you mentioned was the creating velocity profiles for all the various lifts. I mean, that's something that we actually have a great potential to assist on if it was actually possible. I mean, all of our clients in the field right now have their own device, and we capture data on just about everything we can. So that would definitely be a conversation to have maybe after this podcast with you if that's something
absolutely.
of interest. But
absolutely, I definitely would love to take a look at it.
Yeah, I know for a fact we have the highest level of individual velocity profiles of any entity out there, I believe. So that's part of our process is we ship BBT units and we profile people right up front, and that's what we do with all of our clientele. So
fantastic.
We've got a pretty large database of that.
Yeah. So Bryan, we've talked a lot about today, and I think we say this every time just because we get so much stuff out of our guests, but I think we're probably due for a second round with you at some point. But
absolutely.
You've got your book that is recently coming out titled Developing Explosive Athletes, Use of Velocity-Based Training in Training Athletes, and I think people can go to Ultimate Athlete Concepts to purchase that. Is there anywhere else that they can pick that up?
Well, Amazon, it's on there. I think Martin Vingesser's carrying it on his website, Hammer Media. Well, so that would probably be good for the people over in Europe. That might help them on the shipping. Yeah, and I don't know who all. I'm sure Elite FTS is carrying it. But yeah, they can pick it up pretty much anywhere. And of course, if it's on Amazon, you can get it, damn near anywhere in the world.
Sure.
But yeah, that's the place to pick it up at.
And where can our listeners follow you at? Where can they learn more about you? Where can they find content that you're publishing?
Well, the content, anytime that I publish research, I definitely put it out on Twitter, and that's at JBryanMann, JBryanMann. Somebody already had the Bryan Mann, so I had to throw my first initial in front of it. I'm on Facebook. I'm really active with the NSCA. I was real frustrated with it, and I decided that if I thought that it needed to be doing better and doing something else, I was going to get involved. So, I'm the chair of the college SIG, so I run a Facebook page on that. College Strength and Conditioning Coaches Special Interest Group. So I'm on that daily on Facebook. On my own Facebook page, I don't really post a whole hell of a lot. So if people want to get at me, get on Twitter. You can email me at MANN, J as in James, B as in Bryan, at health.missouri.edu. I try and get back to everybody there as quick as I can. But if I miss something, it's not that I'm big timing somebody. It's just that I didn't see it. So just email me a second time. Or, Facebook message or Twitter. I'm really easy on there. I might get a lot of emails because of students and different research projects I'm involved on a daily basis, but I'm not that cool. So I might get like 2 tweets or one Facebook notification a day. So I'm pretty easy to get a hold of in those places, even if I miss the email.
Okay. Excellent.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Bryan. It's great information. I think we would like to get back to you. I have so many other questions, too, about fast twitch and slow twitch and how we prepare those and get the maximum hypertrophy of each source of energy, et cetera, too, that may be different. So, yeah, we'd love to have you back maybe sometime next year. That'd be great.
Yeah, sounds great. It was my pleasure. Thank you guys for the opportunity. I greatly appreciate it.
Thanks again, Bryan. It was a fabulous podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year.
All right. Okay. I think we're good.
Good.
We're out.
Yeah, very good.
All right.
Thanks again, Bryan. I'm glad to
Thank
have
you.
you on. I think people will really enjoy this piece. So we've got a lot of listeners that are interested in that sort of stuff. So I'm sure that'll help out moving a few of these as well. So,
Literally moving.
Yep. Did you see how explosive I was?
Yeah.
That was
That's right. It's because it's on. Is that a bottle of Jack right there? Is it
That
staying next to
same company, but this is modern
Right.
BCAAs.
you? Oh,
So,
okay.
yeah.
All right. All right.
Too bad.
All
All
right.
right. Well, we're gonna sign out. Thanks again.
All right. Thank
Thank you,
you.
Bryan.
Bye-bye.